Hot takes and initial opinions aside, how did the Seattle Kraken actually do at this year's trade deadline, where they sold off a good chunk of their roster that they acquired in the expansion draft? Well, maybe not as bad as a lot of people seem to think. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back as the dust settles after the first ever NHL trade deadline that the Kraken were a major part of. And for the Kraken specifically, it was a particularly busy trade deadline as they end up dealing out 6 players that they acquired in the expansion draft. And it's a deadline that a lot of people, myself included, had some mixed feelings about the moves that the Kraken made. Of course, understandably so, a lot of people want to focus on the Gio and Blackwell trade, but there still were a number of other trades that the Kraken made that give us the more full picture of what Ron Francis was able to do over these last few days. One more thing before we jump right into the trade grades though, you're going to see me using a stat here quite a bit, the GSVA stat, that you may not be familiar with. Basically what it is a version of the WAR stat in the NHL, come up with by Dom Lucian of The Athletic. GSVA standing for Game Score Value Added, but again, it's basically another version of the WAR stat, specifically that Dom uses in his model. Now, why am I using this stat in particular? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. For one, as he's not shy to point out, Dom's model is one of the best analytical models out there for predicting future player and team performances in the NHL. His model, which uses this stat heavily, frequently outperforms most other analytical models and public opinion, plus, when used for betting, almost always turns a profit. All of which is to say that when it comes to using numbers to try to predict the future of a sport that is notoriously hard to predict, Dom is one of the best at it. The other and probably bigger reason that I'm using it here specifically is because Dom has also used it to apply to the NHL entry draft to show the relative value of each pick as the draft goes along, which when it comes to what the Kraken did specifically in this year's trade deadline, is a pretty useful tool. Now, with all the picks the Kraken picked up at this year's trade deadline, they are all coming from teams that are either pretty much guaranteed or very likely to make the playoffs, which means those picks will come in the back half of whatever round they're in. And for the sake of argument, we'll just say they're somewhere in the middle of that back half of each round. So a second round pick then is going to be somewhere around a 55 to 56 overall pick, and a third rounder somewhere in the high 80s. And so when it comes to using the GSVA stat to apply a future value to those picks, those are the overall pick values that we'll be using. Finally, it's also probably worth mentioning that the GSVA value given to a draft pick is the estimated cumulative value over that draft pick's first 7 seasons as a player. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get to grading these trades that Ron Francis and the Seattle Kraken made over these last few days in this first ever trade deadline season for the Kraken. I am going to try to get through these relatively quickly, so if you want a more full reaction to my first thoughts on each of these trades, I did put out a full video about that just a day ago, so feel free to check that one out as well. And we might as well start with the first trade that the Kraken made, sending Jarnkrok to the Calgary Flames for a 2022 second, a 2023 third, and a 2024 seventh, as well as retaining half of Jarnkrok's remaining salary. For the Kraken, Jarnkrok had been a pretty decent middle six contributor all season long, not really significantly standing out in any way positively or negatively, and in basically every measure was a league average player. That having been said, with Seattle being an expansion team and therefore not having a forward end that had a particularly obvious top end of its own, Jarnkrok maybe did stand out a little bit more in Seattle than he would most other places. And maybe it's for that reason that in a trade deadline where forwards not named Claude Giroux were not drawing particularly much in return, Jarnkrok is able to get a pretty good return for Seattle from Calgary, with that second, third, and seventh coming back to Seattle, totaling a GSVA value of 2. While Jarnkrok was on pace to provide Seattle 0.5 this season. Now, again, that GSVA value for the draft picks is an estimated total value over the next 7 seasons combined. So it averages out then to a per year value of 0.29, which is not the same as the 0.5 that Jarnkrok was giving Seattle this year. And yeah, it's a little tricky to evaluate the value of a draft pick versus a current player, but we're trying to do our best here. It's probably worth pointing out here, though, that with Jarnkrok at 30 years of age, he's probably coming down off of his prime, which means his value would likely decline over the next few years. And probably more importantly, as you're going to hear a few times over the course of this video, since it was true of all the players the Kraken dealt at the deadline, Jarnkrok was on an expiring contract, so there was a decent chance he wasn't going to end up back in Seattle anyway. thereby making his value to the Kraken 0 going forward. All in all then with this trade, well, I definitely will miss Jarnkrok and that awesome last name that means Iron Hook, which is a perfect fit for Seattle. With the value added, especially considering what most forwards were drawing in the trade deadline, I'm going to give Seattle an A on this one. The next trade is the big one, and that being the trade of Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for a 2022 second, a 2023 second, and a 2024 third. And again, with my much longer, full reaction to this trade in particular in that previous video, I'll keep the reaction to this one relatively short. Again, the Kraken will definitely miss Colin Blackwell as a key part of that line of Gord, Blackwell, and Appleton that had been so much fun to watch over this last month. The best line the Kraken had on the forward end in that span. Plus, losing their first ever captain in the first season also hurts a little bit. And as far as value lost, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to measure those intangible parts that Gio adds with his leadership and veteran presence in the locker room. That having been said, at least on the ice, Gio was on pace to provide the Kraken with 0.5 GSVA, which is a noticeable step down from where he once was in his career. And with him at the age of 38, I don't know that that's going to drastically improve going forward anytime soon. Or ever, really. Meanwhile, Blackwell was having one of the best, if not the best season of his career, on pace to give the Kraken a full 1 point of GSVA, though with that having been said, that is over an 82-game season, and Blackwell had only played 39 games for Seattle and was only going to get somewhere around 60 if he played the rest of the year. Still though, even if you take a little bit off of that Blackwell value, bringing it down to the number of games that he was going to play, making the total lost here for the Kraken somewhere around, let's say, 1.3, that is by far the most value the Kraken lost in a single trade, which should be pretty obvious based on the players leaving, but it was also the biggest return the Kraken got with those 2 seconds and a third, returning the Kraken 3.2 value in GSVA over these next 7 seasons, averaging out to 0.46, just under 0.5, in each year. And again, over the next couple of seasons especially, it is true that Blackwell and Gio certainly would have had more to offer the Kraken than any of those draft picks will if Seattle uses them to pick players in the draft, but still, overall, I think the long-term value is better for the Kraken here, especially when you consider, again, both of these guys were going to be UFAs at the end of the season, and with Gio in particular, I don't think there was a strong likelihood he was going to get re-signed by Seattle, even if he stuck out the rest of the year here. Most of us had accepted Gio was leaving, and the part that stung more about this trade, though, was Blackwell, who, if he had stuck around, maybe the Kraken would have extended him, and then we would see him here in Seattle for probably the next couple to few years. Still though, there's no guarantee that would have happened, and if they do both go to free agency and leave, it's certainly better for the Kraken that they get something here rather than nothing in the long run. And again, for what it's worth, I don't think it's particularly likely that Blackwell does re-sign in Toronto at the end of the year, so there's still a chance, even if it's a slim one, that Seattle could go after him in free agency at the end of the season and bring him back to Seattle for next season anyway. Again, I don't think that's particularly likely, but it's still a possibility. As I've said before though, the problem that I have with this trade, and the reason that I'm giving it a C+ for Seattle, is that, well, yes, in a vacuum, it's really not that bad of a deal at all for the Kraken. The fact of the matter is it's not in a vacuum, and with all the other things going on around the trade deadline, it is a pretty underwhelming return that Seattle gets back for Gio and Blackwell. Now, if this trade was for just Gio, and also the Kraken retaining half of his salary, which they end up doing anyway, then I think it's a pretty even deal, even if that third turns into more of a later round pick. But throwing Blackwell in there as well does make it a little bit more underwhelming, especially considering the value that he was giving the Kraken over the last month, both in his forward line and as well on the penalty kill. And also with Blackwell being 28, so somewhere around the average prime of his career, he does still probably have a couple more seasons of offering around that 1 value per season. Before we move on though, real quick while we're on the subject of this Gio Blackwell trade, since I didn't mention it in the previous video, there have been a lot of people thinking that maybe the reason Seattle didn't get as great of a return is because Gio forced their hand into going to Toronto, where admittedly was his first choice of a destination, with it being his hometown. And I've also seen people saying that Gio didn't want to be here, or that he was the one requesting a trade out in the first place, neither of which though is true. Both Ron Francis and Gio have said multiple times that Francis was the one who approached him first about the possibility of being traded. Now, obviously, Gio was open to the idea of being traded, and he can't be blamed for being excited about having a chance to go to the playoffs one more time at the age of 38 and having another chance to get that still elusive Stanley Cup. That having been said, with Toronto's track record, I don't know how far they'll make it, but still. And yes, Giordano was honest with the Kraken, saying that Toronto would be his first choice, and that's where he ends up going. Still, though, when asked about whether or not he used the limited no movement clause that he had in his contract, Francis said that Gio gave him the option to trade him wherever the Kraken felt was going to get them the best return. In the end, with Francis especially being an ex-player and having respect for Gio, especially as the veteran player that he is, they do end up making it work to send him to Toronto, and in the end, I don't know that they really got that much less in return than they could have from, say, Florida, for example. Now, I know what you're going to say. Florida did give Montreal a first, a fourth, and a prospect in exchange for Sherratt, and that first is coming in the ever-coveted 2023 draft. Still, though, Sherratt is 8 years younger than Gio and could offer the Panthers a lot more going into the future if they choose to re-sign him. Moving on, though, easily the most disappointing trade that the Kraken made of this trade deadline was their trade of Mason Appleton back to the Winnipeg Jets, where he came from in the expansion draft, for just a 2023 fourth-round pick. Now, even for someone like me who really liked Mason Appleton, it's more than fair to say that he did have a disappointing season here in Seattle. Certainly did a lot less for the Kraken than I was expecting and really thinking he would do. Still, though, it did seem like he was really starting to come into his own over these last few weeks in that line with Gordon Blackwell. It's definitely possible that part of the reason Appleton ended up getting moved was because Blackwell got moved before him, which I guess could make some sense. Still, though, with him being 26 years old, the best could very well still be ahead for Appleton, and with the Kraken dealing him away, that isn't going to happen in Seattle. Plus, all they get back for Appleton is that fourth-round pick, which, as far as GSVA is concerned, is likely only worth 0.3 over the next 7 seasons. And regardless of whether or not Appleton did actually improve in Seattle going forward if he had stayed, I think it's safe to say he probably had more value to Seattle in the future than a fourth-round pick will. Especially considering that with his down year in a contract season, with him being an RFA at the end of this year, he probably wasn't going to be a particularly large cap hit, at least over the next couple of seasons. This trade is also somewhat disappointing because even outside of the fact that, again, I had a soft spot for Appleton, the fact that he also ends up getting moved does drastically reduce the possibility in my mind that the Kraken go after Blackwell in free agency, trying to reunite that line, as they're not going to end up getting Appleton back. From the worst trade of the deadline to easily the best trade the Kraken made in these last few days, with the trade of Jeremy Lauzon to the Nashville Predators, the Kraken get an absolute steal of a second-round pick in return. As I've said before, this is a trade that caught everyone completely off guard in a number of different ways. For one, I really didn't think Lauzon was even a player the Kraken were looking to trade, and as it turns out, with Ron Francis's press conference after the fact, yeah, they really weren't shopping him whatsoever at the trade deadline. Nashville just ended up calling them, asking about Lauzon, and when, in the end, they offered a second-round pick, Seattle really had no choice but to accept that, considering the value they were getting in return. Now, as I said in the reaction video, I didn't dislike Lauzon nearly as much as a fair number of people in the Kraken fanbase seems to. Yes, he absolutely did have a terrible start to the season for Seattle, but he was one of the most improved players on the Kraken over the course of the season. Still, though, as far as the numbers say, that tough start to the year for him definitely still shines through, with a negative 2.3 that he was on pace for as far as GSVA is concerned by the end of the season, which does put him safely in the bottom 10% across the league. Now, again, he's just 24 years old, so there's plenty of room for improvement with Lauzon, and the physical aspect that he provides in his game, once harnessed a little bit better than he was able to do in Seattle, could be quite valuable down the road. That having been said, a second-round pick with a GSVA value of 1.3 over the first 7 seasons of the player's career does have a much better chance of giving the Kraken a more positive return in even the next few seasons, even coming on a younger player. So, with respect to Lauzon, who again, I didn't hate watching in a Kraken uniform and did enjoy the one massive hit that he was good for per game, getting a second-round pick back in return for Seattle makes this one an absolute A+ trade for Ron Francis. And finally, in the last trade the Kraken made, or at least the last trade they made where they gave up something for what they got in return. The Kraken send 31-year-old forward Marcus Johansen back to the DC Capitals, where he played a few seasons ago, in exchange for a 2022 fourth, a 2023 sixth, and forward Daniel Sprong. Now, just Johansen for Sprong I think would have been a pretty good trade for the Kraken. For one, Sprong just turned 25, so he's a few years younger than Johansen, and on top of that, even just this season, he's a fairly comparable player. He has roughly the same GSVA value and a much better offensive upside. Plus, again, those almost 7 years younger that he is does mean he has even more room for improvement going on into the future for Seattle, assuming they re-sign him with him being an RFA at the end of the season. And for a little bit more on Sprong, again, he just turned 25, he's a right-shot winger, and was a former second-round pick, 46th overall, by the Pittsburgh Penguins in the 2015 entry draft. Since then, he's played in at least a few games of 6 different NHL seasons, now with a career total of 186 games, in that time putting up 64 points on 40 goals and 24 assists. And so far this season, in 47 games, has 14 points with 8 goals and 6 assists in Washington, but is also coming off of his best year for them with 20 points on 13 goals and 7 assists in 42 games. On top of that, again, while the highlight of his value is on the offensive side, he's a pretty good all-around forward as well, with some pretty good Corsi stats, a career 52.3 Corsi for percentage there. Though to be fair, the advanced stats don't all necessarily agree on Sprong, where to this point in his career, if you're more into expected goals, he has been an expected plus minus of negative 1.2 over those 186 games. Still though, as far as the trade is concerned, and assuming Sprong is re-signed going into the future, considering Johansen was probably going to end up leaving the Kraken anyway in the offseason with him being a UFA, the Kraken would have ended up losing him for free, but instead get Sprong an opportunity to have immediate value going into the next few seasons, and on top of that, get at least a little bit of draft capital in return as well. Now again, it's just a 4th and a 6th, which is only valued at a total 0.5 over the next 7 seasons, as far as GSVA is concerned, but still, even with that on top of Sprong, the Kraken definitely got a good deal here. I'm giving this trade an A. If the Kraken don't re-sign Sprong, maybe that goes down to a B, but still, it's better to get something rather than nothing. And even just giving Sprong a 1-month tryout on the Kraken is definitely something. Also, for what it's worth, Sprong is one of the players I was looking at as a potential in the expansion draft, but is also one of the guys the Capitals ended up protecting. So, as far as that's concerned, the Kraken end up trading away Johansen in exchange for a guy they couldn't have got last June. Or, I guess, July. There is one more trade that the Kraken made, though I'm not going to bother giving it a grade. Rhyming aside, that's because the Kraken don't give anything back to the Minnesota Wild in return for Victor Rask. I mean, technically they give future considerations, but for those wondering what that means, it usually means nothing. It's just that there has to be a placeholder for a team getting anything via trade. So it's kind of like when in baseball you occasionally see a trade where a player goes to a team in exchange for like $1, for example. Plus, with Rask also being on an expiring contract and being sent right to the AHL, curiously, rather than coming to the Kraken, there's no guarantee that he ends up getting re-signed. I do think he'll end up playing games for the Kraken by the end of the season, but I'm not sure this is a guy the Kraken see as a part of the future, though I've got to say it's pretty hard to tell at this point. Either way, let's give a little bit more of an overview of who the Kraken are getting in Rask. He is a 29-year-old center, having recently just turned 29, a former second-round pick, 42nd overall in the 2011 entry draft. Since then, he's played in 488 games where he has 215 points on 85 goals and 130 assists. He's been in and out of the lineup for Minnesota this season, having played in just 29 games where he has 13 points on 5 goals and 8 assists, but is coming off of a much more full year, having played 54 games, which was almost the entirety of last year's season, where he was almost a half point per game player with 23 points in 10 goals and 13 assists. And as far as the advanced stats are concerned, well, again, much like Sprong, though even more so with Rask, they have a hard time agreeing on what he is as a altogether player, where Corsi 4 says he is a fantastic player consistently well above 50%, with a career 55.9 Corsi 4 percentage. Meanwhile, expected plus minus is a bit of a different story, where he has been, until recent years, consistently a negative player, with a career total negative 6.4. Though, in 2 of the last 3 years, he did have a 2.5 so far this season, and 2 years ago was a 3.5 in Minnesota. And again, like Sprong, was another player that people were looking at as a potential in the expansion draft for Seattle to get then, that ends up in Seattle anyway. Though with him, I'm happy they took Susie over Rask, but still he ends up here one way or another. So how did this trade deadline go as a whole for the Kraken? Well, honestly, I think it went pretty well. The Kraken end up trading out 6 players who were on pace to give the Kraken a cumulative GSVA value on the season of just over positive at 0.2. Now, a big part of the reason for that is the negative 2.3 of Lauzon. The rest of the 5 had right around 2.5, again, accounting for the large chunk of the season that Blackwell didn't play. Meanwhile, in return, the Kraken raked in the draft capital, ending up adding 4 second-round picks, 2 third-round picks, 2 fourth-round picks, 1 sixth-round pick, and 1 seventh-round pick, as well as 4 of those picks coming in this year's draft, 4 coming in next year's draft, and 2 in 2024. 10 picks in total that, given where they're likely to end up in their respective drafts, would accumulate to a total GSVA value added for the Kraken of 7.3, again over the next 7 seasons. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Ron Francis did also say in his post-trade deadline press conference that he would be somewhat surprised if the Kraken end up using all of those picks in their respective drafts and don't end up using some of them in trades as currency to pick up other players. So for those of you who are concerned about the fact that all of these players going out and all of these draft picks coming back in just means that the Kraken aren't looking to actually be competitive for the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seasons, or whatever your outlook is. Again, the Kraken are probably going to use some of these as currency to try to be competitive here in the next couple of years. On top of the fact that as things stand right now, the Kraken are likely to have somewhere in the ballpark of $24 million in cap space going into this free agency period, where they will once again be buyers and in on every possible target that they can get their hands on. And we'll do a more full-fledged look at who those free agents the Kraken could go after will be once we get closer to free agency season, considering that a number of guys still could sign contracts before then, which we've already seen a couple of those go off the board in the last few weeks. But there's still names like Philip Forsberg that could be available for Seattle to go after. I think it's safe to say they probably won't be cup contenders in the next couple of years, but that probably wasn't going to happen anyway. And again, next season could be vastly improved just from improved goaltending, which, even if it's still Drieger and Grubauer, I think it's fairly safe to say they would have a hard time having a worse season than they had this year, especially at the beginning of the year. And just in case you're one of the people, and I know you're out there, I've seen you making your comments, that has lost all faith in Ron Francis as a GM, and therefore might not have full faith that even with all of those draft picks that he would actually be able to turn them into good players. Well, Ron Francis's track record as a GM, or even the director of player operations back when he was with Carolina, would point to exactly the opposite, where at least as far as it comes to drafting, especially in the second and third rounds, where he now has 13 picks in just those 2 rounds over the next 3 seasons, 10 of those coming in the next 2 drafts. Now, it's worth mentioning that with the NHL draft, well, it still is seen in a lot of ways with picks being basically a lottery ticket as to whether or not the player will end up working out in the NHL. It is much less random than, say, the NFL draft, for example, that Seattle fans in particular might be more familiar with, which is part of why first-round picks are much more valuable, even in the eyes of GMs, than they might be in the NFL, even a late first-round pick. A couple of different studies done on players that were drafted in the 90s and 2000s have shown that a first-round pick has a roughly 63% chance of playing 200 games in the NHL, and roughly 80% chance of playing 50 games. Meanwhile, a second and third round pick, which is what the Kraken now have quite a bit of, a second round pick has about a 25% chance of playing in 200 games and a 44% chance of playing in 50. Third round pick is down to just 12% chance to play 200 games and 30% to play 50. Now again, it's worth mentioning that those numbers are coming from players drafted in the 90s and 2000s, back when each round in the draft was far shorter because there were fewer teams. So then you might even expect those numbers to be even lower at present day. But if you didn't believe me that Ron Francis is good at drafting in the second and third round, well, just see for yourself. Here we have a full list of all the players drafted in the second and third round by the Carolina Hurricanes while Ron Francis was in their front office. The first 3 years as the director of hockey operations, where he still would have had a say, and the last 4 as the general manager, where he would have the final say. And for each player, we also have the number of games that they have to this point played in the NHL. Now, right off the bat, you might recognize some of these names. I mean, for one, in 2011, you can see that he was part of drafting Victor Rask in the second round, who we just talked about coming to the Kraken. And then way down in the other corner, we have Morgan Geekie, who now plays for the Kraken as well, being drafted in the third round in 2017. But also of note would be Brett Pesce, drafted in 2013 in the third round, Alex Nedeljkovic, who the Kraken just played against, drafted in 2014 in the second, as well as probably the crowning jewel of all of them, Sebastian Aho, who was taken by Ron Francis in 2015 in the second round. But going back to those hit rates that we talked about of second or third rounders playing 200 or 50 games in the NHL, where, again, a second rounder has just a 25% chance of playing 200 games across their career, you can see that Ron Francis has beaten those odds, where just in the second round, he has drafted 4 players of the 8 that have already played over 200 games, and 7 of them have already played over 50, with all of those extra 3 likely to go over 200 by the end of their career. And sure, in the third round, he's much closer to those average numbers, with just 2 of the 9 so far having played over 200 games in the NHL, and 3 of them having played over 50, again with that third likely to break 200 by the end of his career. But still, that's pretty good considering a couple of those guys, especially in say the 2016 and 17 draft, could maybe still make it up to the NHL by the end of their playing days. And even as far as his first draft for the Kraken in last year's draft is concerned, both the second and third round picks the Kraken made there have so far turned out pretty well. Neither one of them has played for the Kraken yet, obviously, but both have been playing exceptionally in their respective leagues, where the second round pick in Riker Evans, who a lot of people said was a reach at the time, which I guess is still true regardless of what he ends up doing, has been a near point per game player in 56 games in the WHL for the Regina Pats this season. Meanwhile, their third round pick in Ryan Winterton has had a bit of a rougher season as far as injuries are concerned that kept him out of a large portion of their OHL season. But since coming back from injury and then a stint with COVID, in the 26 games he has played in the OHL, he has been well over a point per game with 15 goals and 19 assists. All in all then, as far as the trade deadline is concerned, the Kraken, I think, did a fantastic job. In total, I'd probably give them, I'll call it a B+, raking in a ton of draft picks, a lot of them second round picks and even a couple of third rounders, which again, Ron Francis at the helm has proven that he has a track record of being successful drafting in those rounds. And even if he does end up trading some of those picks for players that can make a more immediate impact, that can only help the Kraken in the next couple of seasons. Whether or not the Kraken improve next year, well, I'd have to say it's pretty hard for them to do worse than they've done this year, and an extra season of having all played together will probably help them going into next season as well. And either way, they are set up pretty well for the future. Please do feel free to let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Maybe give each of these trades the Kraken made at the trade deadline a grade of your own. I'd love to see what you guys think. And until next time, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, and go Kraken.